The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Rodriguez pushed his cart down the marble hallway of Pinnacle Financial Tower. 23rd floor, suite after suite of corner offices where million-dollar deals were struck daily. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished stone, a sound so commonplace that the suited figures rushing past didn't even register his presence. At 52, Marcus had perfected the art of invisibility. Grey uniform pressed but faded, baseball cap pulled low over graying temples, eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He'd been cleaning these halls for 3 years now, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, a ghost in the machine of corporate success. "Watch it," snapped Jessica Chen, nearly colliding with his cart as she rushed toward the elevator, her Louboutin heels clicking urgently against the floor. She didn't apologize, didn't even glance back. To her, Marcus was furniture that moved, nothing more. Marcus simply adjusted his cart and continued down the hall. He'd long ago stopped expecting acknowledgement from the executives who worked here. They lived in a different world, one measured in stock options and quarterly reports, where a janitor's existence barely registered as a blip on their radar. The elevator dinged, and out stepped Richard Blackstone, Pinnacle's youngest senior partner at 38. Tall, sharp-suited, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no, Richard commanded attention wherever he went. Today, however, something was different. His usually perfect composure showed hairline cracks, stress lines etched around his eyes. Marcus had learned to read people in his years of invisible observation. Richard was carrying more than just his leather briefcase today. He was carrying the weight of something heavy, something that made his shoulders sag despite his efforts to project strength. "Morning, Mr. Blackstone," Marcus said quietly, as he had every morning for 3 years. Richard paused, startled. It was the first time in months he'd actually heard the janitor speak. "Oh, yes, morning." The response was automatic, distracted. Richard's mind was clearly elsewhere, wrestling with whatever crisis had put those worry lines on his face. As Richard disappeared into his corner office, Marcus continued his rounds. But something nagged at him. In his peripheral vision, he'd caught something that the rushing executive had missed. Richard's briefcase hadn't closed properly, and several documents had scattered across the hallway floor. Marcus gathered the papers carefully, noting the urgent red stamps and the way Richard's usually pristine signature looked shaky on the last few pages. Financial projections, merger documents, something about a hostile takeover bid. The kind of papers that could sink a career if they fell into the wrong hands. He knocked softly on Richard's office door. No answer. Through the frosted glass, he could see Richard pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in frustration. Marcus tried the door, unlocked. He slipped inside, intending to simply place the documents on the desk and leave, but Richard's voice stopped him cold. "No, Dad, you don't understand. The whole company is about to go under. 20 years of your work, everything you built, it's all going to collapse because I trusted the wrong people." Richard's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." Marcus had heard enough private conversations over the years to know when to leave, but something in Richard's voice held him frozen. This wasn't just business frustration. This was the sound of a man watching his world crumble, carrying the weight of disappointing someone who mattered more than any profit margin. Richard ended the call and slumped into his chair, head in his hands. That's when he noticed Marcus standing there, holding the scattered documents. "How long have you been there?" Richard's voice was sharp, defensive. "Just arrived, sir. Your papers fell in the hallway." Marcus placed the documents gently on the desk. He should have left then, should have returned to his cart and continued his rounds. Instead, he found himself asking, "Everything all right, Mr. Blackstone?" Richard laughed bitterly. "All right? My company's about to be bought out by vultures who'll gut it for parts. 20 years of my father's legacy, thousands of jobs, all because I was too trusting and too proud to see the knife coming for my back. He looked up at Marcus with eyes red-rimmed from stress and sleepless nights. Not that you'd understand. No offense. Marcus felt the familiar sting of assumption, the automatic dismissal that came with his uniform, but tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the raw pain in Richard's voice, or the way defeat had stripped away his usual corporate armor. Maybe it was just that Marcus was tired of being invisible. "Try me," Marcus said quietly. Richard stared at him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "You really want to know?" "My partner, someone I trusted completely, has been secretly negotiating to sell our client list to our biggest competitor. Not just sell it. He's been feeding them our strategies, our bids, everything. When the board finds out tomorrow, they'll force a sale. Hartley Industries will buy us for pennies on the dollar, fire half the staff, and strip mine everything my father spent his life building." Marcus nodded slowly. "Samuel Hartley's company." Richard blinked. "You know about Hartley Industries?" "I know Samuel Hartley." Marcus pulled off his baseball cap, revealing silver hair and eyes that suddenly seemed much more alert, much more focused. "We have history." Something in Marcus's tone made Richard lean forward. What kind of history? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The kind that ends with a man losing everything he cares about and spending the rest of his life trying to make amends. The office fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 23 floors below. Richard found himself studying this man he'd walked past hundreds of times, seeing details he'd never noticed before. The way Marcus carried himself, despite the janitor's uniform, the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he spoke, as if each word was chosen with precision. 25 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady but weighted with old pain. I was the CFO of Meridian Tech. Rising star, corner office, everything I thought mattered. Samuel Hartley approached me with a deal that seemed too good to pass up. Partnership, he called it. I believed him. Richard's breath caught. He'd heard of Meridian Tech. Every business student studied its spectacular collapse in the late 90s. Hartley didn't want a partnership, Marcus continued. He wanted our proprietary software, our client base, and our talent. I gave him access to everything, thinking we were building something together. Instead, he systematically destroyed us from within. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The company collapsed. 300 people lost their jobs, families destroyed, and I was the fool who opened the door and let the wolf in. Jesus, Richard whispered. You're Marcus Rodriguez, the Marcus Rodriguez. Marcus nodded grimly. The same Marcus Rodriguez who went from CFO to janitor, from penthouse to one-bedroom apartment, from respected executive to cautionary tale. But why are you here? Why this job? Marcus looked out the window at the glittering city below. Because 3 years ago, I learned that Samuel Hartley had his sights set on Pinnacle Financial. And because your father, God rest his soul, was the only executive who tried to help me when everything fell apart. He couldn't save my company, but he tried. He was a good man, Mr. Blackstone, the kind of man who deserves better than watching his life's work get fed to the same shark that destroyed mine. Richard felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of hope and disbelief. You've been watching for 3 years. I've been learning, observing, understanding exactly how Hartley operates, how his companies work, where his weaknesses are. Marcus reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. I know which of your employees has been feeding him information. I know about the shell companies he's using to hide his involvement. I know about the regulatory violations his acquisition team has been covering up. Why? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you say something sooner? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to be sure. Because 25 years ago, my pride and my assumptions cost 300 people their livelihoods. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. He met Richard's eyes. And because I needed to know what kind of man you were, whether you were someone worth saving or just another corporate shark swimming in expensive suits. And what did you decide? Marcus smiled for the first time in 3 years. I decided that apple didn't fall far from the tree. Your father raised a good man. You've just forgotten how to be him. Richard stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Even if you're right, even if you have evidence, it might be too late. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. They're going to demand answers about our falling numbers, about why we're losing clients. And I don't have any good ones. Actually, Marcus said, opening his notebook, you do. Every client Hartley Industries stole from you, they did it using inside information, which violates about 6 different SEC regulations. Every bid they undercut, they had your proprietary data, which constitutes corporate espionage. Every deal they intercepted, they used illegally obtained financial projections. Richard turned around slowly. You have proof of this. 3 years' worth. Times, dates, email trails, financial records, everything admissible in court. Marcus closed the notebook. But here's the thing, Mr. Blackstone. Evidence is only as good as the person presenting it. And right now, I'm just the janitor. My word against Samuel Hartley carries about as much weight as this mop bucket. Understanding dawned on Richard's face. But your word backing mine would carry considerable weight, yes. Especially since I've been documenting everything from the inside, and Hartley's team has no idea I exist. Marcus pulled his cap back on, transforming once again into the invisible maintenance worker. The question is whether you're ready to fight back, or whether you're going to let him win again. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at this man who'd been hiding in plain sight, protecting a company that had never acknowledged his existence. Why? He asked finally. After what happened to you, after how the corporate world chewed you up and spit you out, why would you put yourself on the line again? Marcus thought about the question, about the nights he'd lain awake, replaying every decision that led to Meridian Tech's collapse, about the faces of the employees who'd lost their jobs, the families torn apart by his mistake, about Richard's father, who'd been the only executive to return his calls when the scandal broke, who'd offered him a chance at redemption even when everyone else saw him as toxic. Because 25 years ago, I let pride and assumptions cloud my judgment, Marcus said finally. I thought I was smarter than I was, thought I could handle whatever Hartley threw at me. 300 people paid the price for my arrogance. He looked directly at Richard. I can't undo that, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. What do you need from me? Marcus smiled grimly. I need you to trust me, the same way I trusted Samuel Hartley 25 years ago, except this time, I'm asking you to trust someone who's already lost everything and has nothing left to gain except the chance to do the right thing. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Richard, who'd spent 3 years walking past this man without seeing him, was now being asked to stake his company's future on his word. Marcus, who'd been betrayed by trust once before, was asking someone to make the same leap of faith that had destroyed his life. The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning, Richard said. I know. I cleaned the conference room. Marcus stood up. Mr. Blackstone, there's something else you should know. The employee who's been feeding Hartley information, it's not who you think it is. Richard's stomach dropped. Who? Jessica Chen, your head of client relations. Jessica? That's impossible. She's been with the company for 5 years. She's ambitious, ruthless, and deeply in debt from a gambling problem she's been hiding. Marcus pulled out another small notebook. Hartley's been paying her debts in exchange for information. Started small, client preferences, meeting schedules. But over the past 6 months, she's been copying hard drives, photographing documents, recording private conversations. Richard sank back into his chair. Jessica had been in every major meeting, had access to every client file, knew every strategy they'd developed. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. The good news, Marcus continued, is that her greed made her careless. She's been using company computers to communicate with Hartley's team, and she's been copying files onto drives that are registered to the company's IT system. Everything is documented, time-stamped, and traceable. How do you know all this? Marcus's smile was sad. Because janitors are invisible, Mr. Blackstone. I empty trash cans, clean keyboards, and dust hard drives. People have private conversations in front of me like I'm not there. They leave sensitive documents on their desks, log into private accounts while I'm cleaning their offices. In 3 years of being invisible, I've learned more about this company than most of your executives know. Richard felt a mixture of admiration and horror. This man had been protecting his company for years, gathering evidence of its destruction, preparing for a war that no one else even knew was being fought. Tomorrow morning, Marcus continued, Jessica will present her report on client retention to the board. She's going to paint a picture of systematic failure, of a company that's lost its competitive edge. She'll recommend accepting Hartley's buyout offer as the only way to salvage shareholder value. And you can prove she's been sabotaging us? I can prove she's been systematically feeding our strategies to Hartley Industries, yes. Whether that constitutes sabotage or just treason, I'll let the lawyers decide. Marcus headed toward the door, then paused. Mr. Blackstone, there's one more thing. Your father didn't just try to help me when Meridian Tech collapsed. He succeeded. Richard looked up. What do you mean? He gave me this job, not out of pity, but because he said the only way to prevent another Hartley Industries was to have someone on the inside who understood how they operated. He hired me to be his early warning system. Marcus's voice softened. Your father knew this day would come. He prepared for it. The weight of realization hit Richard like a physical blow. His father hadn't just given a failed executive a job out of kindness. He'd positioned a guardian, someone who understood the enemy, someone who could protect what he'd spent his lifetime building. He never told me, Richard whispered. He didn't want to burden you with old wars, but he made me promise that if Hartley ever came after Pinnacle, I'd be ready. Marcus opened the door. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Blackstone, we finish what your father started. After Marcus left, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the documents scattered across his desk. The man who'd been invisible to him for 3 years had just revealed himself to be the key to everything. The janitor, who emptied his trash can every night, was actually the most qualified person in the building to save his company. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual. Marcus was already there, of course, methodically cleaning the conference room where the board meeting would take place. But now, Richard saw him differently. The careful way he positioned himself to overhear conversations, the strategic timing of his cleaning rounds, the notebooks hidden in his uniform. Are you ready for this? Richard asked quietly. Marcus looked up from wiping down the conference table. I've been ready for 25 years. At 9 o'clock sharp, the board members filed in. Richard's stomach churned as he watched Jessica Chen take her seat, her polished exterior hiding the betrayal that had been systematically destroying his company. She smiled at him warmly, the same smile she'd worn while copying his files and selling his secrets. Before we begin, Richard announced, I'd like to introduce someone who has critical information about our recent performance challenges. The board members looked confused as Marcus entered the room, still wearing his janitor's uniform, but carrying a briefcase that looked decidedly out of place. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard continued, I'd like you to meet Marcus Rodriguez, former CFO of Meridian Tech and current senior security consultant for Pinnacle Financial. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jessica Chen went white as a sheet. Several board members began speaking at once. The chairman, Robert Hayes, banged his gavel for order. "Richard," Hayes said sternly, "this is highly irregular. We're here to discuss the Hartley Industries proposal, not to discuss exactly why we need that proposal," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd once commanded boardrooms, "which is what I'm here to explain." For the next 2 hours, Marcus methodically dismantled the fiction that Pinnacle Financial was failing through incompetence. He presented evidence of corporate espionage, documented the systematic theft of proprietary information, and revealed the scope of Jessica Chen's betrayal with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of someone seeking justice. Jessica tried to deny everything, but Marcus had documentation of her gambling debts, copies of her communications with Hartley's team, and proof of every file she'd stolen. When security escorted her from the building, she was already calling her lawyer. The board voted unanimously to reject Hartley Industries' buyout offer and to file criminal charges for corporate espionage. More importantly, they voted to implement Marcus's recommendations for protecting the company's intellectual property and rebuilding their client relationships. As the meeting ended, Robert Hayes approached Marcus. "Mr. Rodriguez, I hope you'll consider staying on in an official capacity. What you've done here today is exactly what Richard's father hired me to do 3 years ago," Marcus replied. "And yes, I'll stay, but not as a janitor." Richard walked Marcus to his new office that afternoon. Not the corner office that his credentials might have justified, but a comfortable space with a view of the city and a door that actually had his name on it. "I have to ask," Richard said, as Marcus unpacked his few personal belongings. "The notebooks, the documentation, the 3 years of evidence gathering, was all of that really about protecting my father's company, or was it about getting revenge on Samuel Hartley?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, hanging a framed photo of his family on the wall. "Honestly, it started as revenge. When I learned Hartley was targeting Pinnacle, I wanted to hurt him the way he hurt me." He turned to face Richard. "But somewhere along the way, it became about something else. It became about the 300 families who lost their livelihoods because I was too proud to see what was right in front of me. It became about making sure that never happened again." And now, Marcus smiled, and Richard realized it was the first genuinely happy expression he'd ever seen on the man's face. "Now I'm exactly where I belong, protecting good people from bad decisions and preventing the wolves from getting inside the gate." 6 months later, Pinnacle Financial had not only recovered, but was thriving. Marcus's security protocols had become industry standard, and his consulting fees from other companies had made him wealthy again. But more importantly, he'd found something he hadn't realized he'd lost 25 years ago: purpose. Richard stopped by Marcus's office every morning, a ritual that had replaced their hallway encounters. Today, Marcus was reading a newspaper article about Samuel Hartley's indictment for corporate espionage. "How does it feel?" Richard asked, nodding toward the newspaper. Marcus folded the paper carefully. "Like the end of a very long chapter." He looked out the window at the city below. "You know, for 25 years, I thought I was the victim of Hartley's betrayal. But the truth is, I was complicit in my own destruction. I saw what I wanted to see, heard what I wanted to hear, and ignored every warning sign because success had made me arrogant. And now I know the difference between being smart and being wise. Smart is knowing how to make money. Wise is knowing what's worth protecting." Marcus stood up and straightened his tie. Silk now, instead of a janitor's uniform. "Your father was wise, Richard. He understood that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who look like friends, and that the most valuable allies are often the ones no one bothers to see." Richard thought about Jessica Chen, whose polished exterior had hidden her betrayal, and Marcus Rodriguez, whose janitor's uniform had hidden his expertise. Appearances can be deceiving. They can. But character always reveals itself eventually. The question is whether you're paying attention when it does. That evening, Marcus walked through the halls of Pinnacle Financial one last time as an invisible man. Tomorrow, he would be the senior security consultant, respected and acknowledged. But tonight, he wanted to remember what it felt like to be unseen, to understand the power of observation over assumption. The cleaning crew nodded respectfully as he passed. They knew his story now, knew that the man who'd once pushed a cart through these same halls had saved their jobs and protected their futures. But more than that, they understood that he'd never forgotten where he came from or the people who remained invisible. Marcus paused outside Richard's office, where the young executive was working late, preparing for tomorrow's client meetings with the same dedication his father had shown. Through the frosted glass, he could see Richard reviewing security protocols, implementing the changes that would protect the company from future threats. Some stories, Marcus reflected, weren't about dramatic transformations or fairy tale endings. They were about people finding their way back to who they were meant to be, about second chances earned through patience and sacrifice, about the quiet victories that happened when no one was watching. He'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible, and in doing so, he'd discovered something valuable about seeing clearly. The most important truths were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who cared enough to look beyond the surface. Marcus Rodriguez had entered Pinnacle Financial as a broken man seeking redemption. He was leaving as someone who'd found it, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the simple act of being present, being patient, and being ready when the moment came to protect something that mattered. The janitor had been hiding in plain sight, but so had the hero. 3 years later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard Business School, delivering the keynote address at their annual ethics symposium. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once lost everything due to misplaced trust was now teaching the next generation of executives about integrity and vigilance. The most dangerous assumption we make in business, he told the eager faces staring back at him, is that we can judge someone's worth by their position on an organizational chart. I spent 25 years learning that lesson the hard way. In the front row sat Richard Blackstone, now CEO of Pinnacle Financial, watching with pride as his former janitor commanded the respect of some of the brightest minds in business. Beside him sat Maria Santos, the new head of custodial services at Pinnacle, a former investment banker who had lost everything in a Ponzi scheme and was now working her way back up, one floor at a time. Every morning, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, thousands of people walk past the invisible workers who keep their world functioning. They see uniforms, not individuals. They see job titles, not human potential. But what if I told you that the person emptying your trash can today might be the same person who saves your company tomorrow? The audience was silent, hanging on every word. 300 families lost their livelihoods because I was too arrogant to see betrayal hiding behind a friendly smile. But thousands of families kept their jobs because one man was humble enough to see potential hiding behind a janitor's uniform. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Richard Blackstone didn't just give me a second chance. He taught me that redemption isn't about returning to who you were. It's about becoming who you were meant to be. As the thunderous applause filled the auditorium, Marcus caught sight of an elderly man in the back row, tears streaming down his weathered face. It was Tom Richardson, one of the Meridian Tech employees who had lost his job 25 years ago. After the speech, Tom approached Marcus with trembling hands. "Mr. Rodriguez," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion, "I blamed you for years. Lost my house, my marriage fell apart, my kids barely spoke to me. I thought you were the villain in my story." Marcus braced himself for the confrontation he dreaded for decades. "But watching you tonight," Tom continued, "seeing what you've become, what you've done for others, I realize you weren't the villain. You were just another victim who refused to stay down." He extended his hand. "Thank you for turning your pain into protection for others." As Marcus shook Tom's hand, he felt the weight of 25 years of guilt finally lift from his shoulders. The man who had once been too proud to see clearly had learned the most important lesson of all. True strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and making sure others don't have to fall the same way. That night, back in his apartment, Marcus opened his laptop and began typing a letter to his younger self. The arrogant executive who thought success was about being seen and recognized. The letter would become the foundation of his memoir, Invisible, Lessons from the Bottom of the Corporate Ladder. But for now, he simply wrote, "Today I learned that redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily choice to use your scars as a map to help others avoid the same wounds. The janitor taught me more about leadership than the CEO ever did. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we rise to the top, but when we learn to see clearly from the bottom." The next morning, Marcus arrived at Pinnacle Financial, as he had for over 6 years now. But this time, he wasn't invisible. Maria Santos was there, pushing her cart with the same quiet dignity he once had. He stopped her gently. "Maria," he said softly, "remember, you're not just cleaning these offices. You're studying them, learning them, preparing for the day when you'll lead them again." She smiled through tears. "How do you know I will?" Marcus looked around at the gleaming halls where he'd once been invisible, where he'd learned the most important lessons of his life. Because everyone deserves a second chance. And because sometimes the best leaders are the ones who've learned humility from the ground up. As he walked to his corner office, the same corner office that had once belonged to Richard's father, Marcus passed the portrait gallery of Pinnacle's leadership. His own photograph now hung there, with a simple plaque. Marcus Rodriguez, Chief Security Officer, former janitor, current guardian. But it was the smaller plaque beneath it that meant the most to him. In memory of James Blackstone, who taught us that true vision sees potential where others see only position. The man who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility had finally learned the most important truth of all. We are never truly invisible to those who matter. We are only invisible to those who choose not to see. And sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that everyone has hidden depths and untold potential, then you're exactly the kind of person who belongs in our Top Life Stories community. We share real stories about real people who prove that your current circumstances don't define your future possibilities. Stories about second chances, hidden strengths, and the extraordinary power of never giving up on yourself. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week we're sharing the incredible story of a homeless woman who secretly held 3 PhD degrees and used her knowledge to revolutionize how we help people rebuild their lives. These are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us to look beyond the surface, to see the potential in everyone we meet, and to never underestimate the power of quiet dignity and persistent hope. Subscribe now and join thousands of viewers who believe that every person has a story worth telling, and every story has the power to change a life. Thank you for being part of the Top Life Stories family. We'll see you next week.